Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Geekery in General podcast. My name is Al, and joining me today is a returning guest. You might remember him from the episode we did on Star Trek, and that is Jeff from the MetaTrek YouTube channel. How are you doing today, Jeff?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
You're welcome. And before we start with the main topic, just wanted to make a quick announcement. I will be at the Midwest Gaming Classic down in Milwaukee as a vendor. It's the last weekend in the month. So if you happen to be in the Milwaukee area from March 31st through April 2nd, and if you are go to that convention, feel free to stop by the exhibit hall and say hi. I'll be there selling some of my products, and my wife also has a bunch of 3D stuff that she's printed. So we'll have a lot of stuff for sale, and hopefully you'll, even if you just want to stop by and say hi. So the topic we're going to do today is sort of a spin-off of the Star Trek episode, because one of the things we talked a little bit about there is how shows like Star Trek and Star Wars, they are examples of modern mythology. Modern mythology is interesting because I think to some extent it's taken the place of the stories that people used to tell back during ancient times. Except now, instead of telling stories about heroes fighting dragons and monsters or going into the underworld and retrieving some treasure or rescuing someone, instead we tell stories about people flying around in spaceships and blowing things up. So to start this episode, there is a brief passage I'd like to read from encyclopedia.com and their article on modern mythology. Like all myths and legends, modern mythology springs from a sense of life's wonder, excitement, mystery, and terror. Modern legends offer images of the best and worst aspects of the human condition. They suggest that good behavior will be rewarded, and evil, greedy, or foolish behavior will be punished. Some modern legends reflect people's fear of rapid social change or of science and technology. Others appeal to their desire to find meaningful patterns beneath the confusing chaos of ordinary life. So I just thought that was a good intro or to set the stage for the topic we're going to talk about today. So Jeff, you had the idea to bring this topic and talk about Joseph Campbell's 4 functions of myth and how they relate to science fiction and how we can use this to interpret franchises like Star Wars and Star Trek.
Yeah, when you start looking at science fiction as a mythology and you really or Star Trek or Star Wars, you really want to make sure that the mythology is fully functional. And the way that you do that would be to look at these 4 functions. I've done a lot of research with Star Trek in the 4 functions, and I find that Star Trek is fully functional as a mythology. And Star Wars has the potential. I haven't studied that as much, so I don't know the ins and outs. I did a little bit of research on it before we did the podcast. I couldn't find a lot on it, so it was kind of frustrating, but I think we've got enough to at least get a start with that. Mm-hmm. The 4 functions are very important. All of the old mythologies, all of them had these 4 functions. So if you want to find something that can truly be considered a mythology, it has to have these qualities to it.
So I wasn't really too familiar with the 4 functions, so it's something that I did look up before we started recording. So the 4 functions, there's the mystical, the cosmological, sociological, and the pedagogical. Yeah, that.
Pedagogical, yeah. It's kind of a funny word. The first function, the mystical, is also known as the metaphysical function as well. It's gotten 2 names for some reason.
Joseph Campbell, of course, most people are familiar with the Hero of 1,000 Faces, which probably going to get into talking about that just because whether you like the Hero of 1,000 Faces and this idea of the monomyth or not, you can't deny it's had a huge impact in modern storytelling as well as ancient storytelling. So in brief, the hero's journey is, well, it's a monomyth. It's a universal idea that we see repeated in a lot of cultures around the world. They all have their own different interpretations of it, but most heroic myths follow a similar pattern. You've got a hero who receives a call to adventure. They might accept it right away, or they might need a little bit of encouragement. They cross the threshold to adventure, which is the point of no turning back. Along their way, they will meet mentors. They will acquire magic weapons or magic items or other gifts. Usually there's a descent into the underworld. There's a battle with a dragon of some kind. Often another archetype we see is the ogre mother or the ogre father. The hero might have an atonement with the mother goddess or the father god. Sometimes the hero is killed and then resurrected. Sometimes he needs help returning to the world of mortals, but eventually he returns with the boon of his quest. So, like I said, that's the monomyth in brief.
Yep. That's a pretty good encasement of it there. It's interesting. Some people, like you were saying, if you like it or not, some people have issues with it because Campbell would phrase things in such a way that it made it sound like it covered all of the bases. So it's they either die or survive. They either go left or right. Now, that he didn't use that one, but just as a kind of an example. But what you'll find are when he talks about there are two ways that something can go, they're always on a dyad. So they're not just generally covering everything, like anything can happen. So this thing covers like every contingency. So it's usually at certain points, one of two things are going to happen. And they're often based on the particulars of the story, the message that's being brought through. And, it's not arbitrary. That argument against it, I think, doesn't really hold water.
Well, one of the criticisms people have of Joseph Campbell's monomyth and Hero with a Thousand Faces is some people say that it's so vague that it's practically meaningless. Yeah. And the fact that a lot of Hollywood movies and modern story writers usually base their work on this myth, that's led them to release safe films where you almost can really kind of predict ahead what's going to happen. And you're making these stories that are going to be so universal that it's like, well, we've already seen them done how many times before.
Yeah, but we always seem to love it when they do it again. It speaks to something deeper within us. It's sort of the facade that you look through to see the deeper meanings in life. Just like the new Avatar movie, those are Hero's Journey 101 stories, but we still love them, and they're still like, the biggest grossing movies of all time.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that the Hollywood tends to adhere to this is because they know this formula works. And of course, movies take a lot of money to make. So they want to make sure that after they've invested millions and millions of dollars into making this film, that, they get a return on that investment.
Well, you mentioned how much it costs to make movies, and that it's sort of interesting that, what is it about movies that, these are some of the most expensive things that we make in the world. Some of these movies have like the budget of a small country, $100 million, $120 million. It says that there's really something going on there that we're willing to spend so much money on these things, and then they rake in billions of dollars. So, it really tells you something is going on there. We're really fascinated by them.
Why do you think that these movies are so popular, and why, even though they do sometimes follow these formulaic storylines, we can't help but go back and watch them?
Exactly for the reason that we're talking tonight. It's because they have a mythological aspect shining through, and that has always fascinated humanity. These are the stories that we tell and retell we've told and retold forever, and we'll tell and retell forever into the future.
And I think you make a good point there because, like, for example, creation myths, usually there's 4 themes that you see common across the world. The first example might be like a deity just willing the universe into existence. You also see stories where the heaven and earth split apart. There's the fertilization of the primordial waters, and another prominent theme, the dismemberment of the primordial giant.
Creation myth is another important staple of a mythology. Every mythology has to have a creation myth. Star Trek's creation myth seems to be based on the steady state, continuous creation theory. And this was from actually an animated episode called The Magics of Megas 2. And in this episode, they go to the center of the galaxy and they discover newly forming matter being created at the center. And the ship gets sucked in through a vortex into the center of the galaxy, which is probably supposed to be a metaphor for the center of everything. And they find this planet in there with these magical beings, kind of like archons almost. And not a fully formed creation story, but it's as close as Star Trek seems to come to a general creation story of how everything got here. As far as Star Wars goes, did any of the movies or shows touch on a creation story in Star Wars?
None that I've seen. I mean, I'm sure they've talked about how, like some of the episodes of stuff outside of the movies, they probably touched a little bit on maybe what some alien races viewed as the creation. But I don't know what the specific creation story behind the Star Wars universe is. And I have to say, one of the things that fascinates me about if we ever do manage to make contact with alien life, and if we ever do manage to find a way to communicate and translate each other's languages, honestly, one of the first things I would really be interested in is finding about how their religious beliefs, especially their creation stories, to see how much mirrors some of the stories we see on Earth. And, even how did their religions develop compared to religions on Earth? I mean, have they gone through the same series where you had religions start to organize and grow larger and then split apart? Or did they have religions that managed to remain more or less the same through the years? So call me a nerd, if you will, or a geek. But yeah, I find that stuff interesting.
I do too. I think it interesting and mind-blowing, having a chance to talk with a being from another world like that would be just one of the most incredible experiences, I think. Mm-hmm. And also too, depending on how you view the formation of religions, that would have an impact on what they would likely have as a religious system. Like one idea is that religions really developed around a set of codes or rules so that people can live together. And, because if you can't be stealing or killing or, doing all that sort of thing if you want to live as a group. So a lot of this is basically, how do you live together, which is falls under the sociological function of mythology. It's a shared set of beliefs and rights and wrongs. Hero's journey too. I've heard people wonder like what the hero's journey from another world would be like. And I have a feeling it would be like ours, because really when you break it down, it's a story of going from the familiar to the unfamiliar, discovering something and then coming back, which is really the thing you do every day when you leave your house and you come home at night. You have a daily hero's journey that you go on. So you would think that no matter where you are, you would have that same 3-step process of being here, going there, and then coming back to here again. So, and also too, another thing about religion and mythology, all of this, and this is a Jungian idea, that mythology was a primitive form of psychology. By primitive, not being a simple form, but just being an earlier form of psychology. And so what that also tells you is that all of this comes from the psyche, the human psyche. And that could be one reason why there's a monomyth and one reason why there's a collective unconscious, because we're all human and we all have the same basic elements of our mind, and the unconscious and all the aspects of that would be commonly shared throughout humanity. So we would tell stories about that, in which mythologies and heroes' journeys are really just stories about us going into our own psyche and then coming back with some hidden gem of knowledge that's been lost for thousands of years, or maybe never uncovered before.
And that would go more into the pedagogical function with, how to live. And we'll get to that, of course, later. Why don't we go to the first two functions? We've already talked about a little bit about the third and fourth. So we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let's start with the first one, the mystical. So this is, the way I've heard it described, is opening the heart and mind and learning to experience the awe and wonder of the universe.
Yep. And that I think in Star Wars, I think the Force is a good example of the mystical or metaphysical function that is the mysterious aspect of Star Wars that permeates everything. And Star Trek, what I've discovered is that it seems to focus more on the other half of the mystical function, which would be dealing with the horror of life. Well, what that comes through as, and what Campbell talked about a lot, was the horror of having to continually kill other things in order to live. And that's exemplified in an episode called Wolf in the Fold, where Spock states that we all feed on death, even vegetarians. And that speaks right to the heart of this aspect of the mystical function. In Star Trek, we were talking a little bit earlier, I think before we started, about technology and how people don't trust it. And it's, in a lot of science fiction is, cautionary tales against too much technology, or technology developing too quickly or getting out of hand, which is a very understandable concern. Star Trek even touches on that as well, with like Star Trek The Motion Picture with V'ger, and Star Trek original series episode called The Changeling with Nomad. Those were both examples of our technology coming back and trying to wipe us out, basically.
Whenever I see a video of like some new robot that has very human-like movements, and I'm not sure if some of these are genuine videos or if it's just a fake video someone put together, but whenever I see those videos, I'm like, haven't these people seen a Terminator movie?
Yeah, it seems like we're headlong right into that, aren't we? In Star Trek, one of the things that's sort of unique about it is that they look at technology as being of kind of our salvation as well. Mm-hmm. And that they've turned Earth back into a paradise and a utopia of sorts. And one of the interesting things, and one of the ways they get over or get past this, the horror aspect of life where we have to kill to survive, is that they have food replicators. So in an episode of The Next Generation, Commander Riker's an episode called Lonely Among Us, I think it is. He talks about how we no longer have to kill our food, that these replicators form it out of non-organic material. So we've sort of solved that problem of feeding on death. The other aspect of it, the awe of life, in Star Trek, you can use Spock as an example of a guide for that, because and this might sound familiar to you. I know you're not a big Star Trek fan, but you've probably heard Spock say fascinating.
Yeah.
or interesting. So he is in a constant state of fascination. And I think that's a good role model for us to go by, the awe of life, and to be constantly fascinated by the world, or at least interested, which is like a mild form of fascination.
Now with Spock, do you think maybe one of the reasons he took that approach is because, at least looking at the original series, he was the only non-human on the crew? Because I know in some of the later series, they started to bring Klingons and some other races on the crew of the spaceship. But I just remember from the original series, Spock was the only non-human there. So he's like the outsider of the group in a way.
Yeah. In a way, originally he was meant to be really the guide of the group as well. He was sort of like Tonto to the Lone Ranger
yeah.
or the Grizzly Adams. He had like a Native American blood brother that was sort of his guide to the wilderness. So Spock was supposed to be sort of like the native guide in outer space, showing them the terrain. And I think that looking at Spock from another perspective, the reason he took his position on board the Enterprise was because of his fascination with the world and the universe, and that was his best way of getting out there and experiencing all of these things. If you watch the series, when the stories focus on Spock, what they really focus on is mainly him having these incredible experiences through different forms of telepathy or exposure to alien influences. But it really seems to be what his focus was just having these experiences and gaining this knowledge. And he talked a lot about that, about the knowledge that poured through that mind meld was staggering, To
look at things more from the Star Wars perspective, I think the Force really is a good parallel there, because it's supposed to be this life force found in all living things that binds everything together. Which is one of the reasons why I think some people were a little peeved when they introduced the idea of the midichlorians in Phantom Menace.
I was one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it didn't really bother me as much. I mean, I'm a Star Wars fan, but I'm not a super hardcore Star Wars fan. It's funny. One of my friends always like to say that no one hates Star Wars more than the Star Wars fans do. But, I guess and I think this is one of the in-universe explanations, which actually does make sense, is that a high midichlorian count is supposed to be actually a sign of the Force. It's just for whatever reason, it manages to manifest itself in certain people, and hence why they have these higher midichlorian counts. And that's actually one theory as to how Anakin Skywalker became weaker in the Force when he became Darth Vader, because midichlorians require an organic body. And with, Darth Vader, while he had his limbs cut off and the inside of his insides were heavily damaged. So he was nowhere near as powerful as he could have been. Now, of course, he was still very powerful, but he's nowhere near as powerful as he could have been had he not had his limbs cut off and had his body burnt like it was.
I didn't know about that aspect of it. One of the things that I had a problem with the midichlorians was just that it was almost like he was trying to give a scientific explanation for a mystical thing that, it's almost like talking about atoms or viruses or, something science-y, where it sort of took the mystery out of it, actually.
That is true. I mean, it's like with Dungeons and Dragons, you really don't try to find a scientific explanation for why a wizard can cast magic missile or why a wizard can cast fireball. He just does it and boom.
Yep. And plus, Star Wars was never really terribly concerned about science. It really, I think, is more science fantasy than science fiction in that respect. Their ships, it wasn't a concern. You could take an X-Wing fighter from one solar system to another. Maybe fans have come up with explanations for how they power these, little ships and how they can get them vast distances like that. But it never was as science-based. It was always more just about, more of a magical kind of thing, I felt.
And I agree with you on that based on what little I know about Star Trek, because they didn't really have as much of the mystical aspects in there. I think you said that Spock had some sort of like telepathy he used, but I don't recall seeing much of like people moving around stuff with their mind. Whereas in Star Wars, at least in the stuff where there's Jedi, people being able to do all these semi-magical feats is just par for the course.
Yeah. And there was more mysticism in Star Trek than I think a lot of people realize, and that some people are willing to admit. There's a book called Star Trek and Metaphysics, where the author of the book emphatically declares that any hint in Star Trek of a metaphysical world or souls or anything like that can be explained scientifically, every single one of them. And I emphatically disagree with him on that. There are a number of examples where Star Trek indicates that there's some sort of a non-corporeal soul. So you have aliens that are non-corporeal. So they're like a cloud or an energy field or something like that. Now, some of those are just weird alien things, but there are a couple of examples where it's stated that these were humanoids that evolved into this sort of non-corporeal state. So, and there are a couple episodes where they indicate that humans have a soul or something more to us than just a mind and a body. And it really does go into that a little, more than I think people realize. And like Star Wars, the science in Star Trek isn't all that sciencey. If you really pay attention to it, they don't have a lot of science in it. And when they do, a lot of it isn't very accurate,
Yeah, because I think the term that some people use is hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi, where something like Firefly would be hard science fiction because there's not really a scientific, there's not really some super futuristic device that can solve everything. Whereas Star Wars is definitely more soft science fiction. And at least what I know about Star Trek, it would probably be somewhere in that middle ground between hard and soft sci-fi. So now when you talk about like these spiritual beings, where does the Q continuum fit into all this?
So they're somewhat of a mystery, and they exist apparently in some other dimension that they can interact in our dimension. There's the Q continuum, and Q claims that it's some kind of greater reality or something like that they exist in. He talks to Riker in an episode called Hide and Q, and Riker asks him a couple questions, and he says, "Well, I can't explain the true nature of the universe to you, off the cuff, so he kind of avoids the question, but they are apparently a godlike species that seem to be both non-corporeal and physical, but they can interchange at will, I think, between the two."
That almost sounds Lovecraftian in a way, because I don't know if this was a quote that Lovecraft said himself or if this was, I think it was actually in one of his stories, but there was a quote that perhaps the most merciful thing about the universe is that we can't understand it. And I think he was trying to imply that in his fiction, that if we really understood the true nature of things, that our minds wouldn't be able to handle it and we'd just snap and go insane.
I think so. Yeah. I think the true nature of the universe evades us the way that our world and the sort of the world that exists between us humans evades our pets. They live in the world with us, but they don't understand politics or religion or even mathematics. All of that is just sort of a level beyond them. And I think that the true nature of the universe is something like that to us. It's a level beyond us that we can't understand, and it would probably be overwhelming if we were to experience it.
So speaking of the universe, this actually segues nicely into the second function, the cosmological, which I've always found cosmology fascinating, not just as a Dungeons and Dragons fan with the outer planes, the inner planes, but just how different religions came up with these different ideas to explain not how the universe came into existence, but also the physical structure of it. And I've heard that some people say that, well, when you're taking a look at mythology, to some extent, this function has been taken over by science. Because thanks to these high-tech telescopes that we have and improving scientific devices, we are now finally able to start getting a better understanding of what's beyond the solar system. Whereas like, like 100 or so years ago, our telescopes, they could see a galaxy, but we weren't really able to make out a lot of detail. And, now it's like, you look at some of the stuff from like I think it's the James Webb telescope, and, even just the Hubble, it's like, wow, you get these really clear, super clear images.
Yeah, they can really be awe-inspiring. And in that respect, the secular science really has taken over that aspect of, that function for us. And even science has developed its own creation story with the Big Bang. And, and I look at that as just, another example of a creation story. And I think with things like Star Wars and Star Trek, the way that they have sort of gotten a handle on this aspect of mythology is really with the special effects. The same idea as the Hubble telescope or the James Webb. The awe and spectacle of the science fiction movies gives us that feeling of awe. And think about the first scene in the first Star Wars movie with that ship going overhead, and then the blockade runner, and then the Star Destroyer. That just gave you a sense of awe right there.
Oh yeah, and especially when you look at just how in Star Wars, just how the space battles go. I mean, you look at the Battle of Yavin 4 in the first one, and then you look at some of the big space fights in the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy. Now, of course, we're talking about different levels of effects, where the original trilogy, they just had models, and now it's all CGI.
Right. Yeah. And they really, it was really thanks to Star Wars that all of that technology got pushed forward. George Lucas really innovated a lot of things, and he did things when other people would just talking about doing it. He was out there doing it, even making the prequel trilogy, filming that completely on digital cameras. I think that was like the first time that was done, and people thought he was nuts to do it, but he was determined to push all that technology forward. And the original Star Trek series, the special effects were kind of far and few between. They reused a lot of the same shots of the Enterprise from week to week, and would have some novel special effects, usually at least a couple per episode, but they were not, some of them were where they were all probably all inspiring for the time. Then when you get into the movies, especially like Star Trek, the motion picture, if you want to see an awe-inspiring movie, check that out. Especially the ending of it is some of the most beautiful special effects ever, and the creation of a new life form. And it has
that's actually one of the few parts I do remember of the original motion picture, when they're going into that nebula and they meet V'ger, which we find out is actually, the Voyager spacecraft. So
yeah, that's pretty neat. And this also too is we already talked about the creation story, but the cosmological function is where the creation story fits into the four functions.
Fortunately, I'm not sure if there's if there's like a canon creation story for Star Wars. I know you mentioned it sounds like they tried to develop something like that for Star Trek. Does that have, because I remember there was the Voyage Home where they went in, or no, Star Trek 5, where wasn't that the one where they met some guy in the center of the universe who claimed to be God or something like that? Or
yeah, they go back to the center of the galaxy again and go through the Great Barrier, which they seem to indicate was there in the animated episode as well. So there's this Great Barrier that sort of protects the center of the galaxy, and then there's also one that protects the outside of the galaxy. In the first, or actually the second pilot of the original series, they go to the Great Barrier at the edge of the galaxy. It's an energy barrier, and that turns one of the crew members, or two of them actually, into godlike beings that have telekinetic powers, and they become, well, the one, Gary Mitchell, he becomes rather amoral and has to be destroyed. And so that's an example of the sociological function, when, of right and wrong, good and bad, and what happens when you act badly. Your society will either kick you out or kill you.
Yeah. That actually goes back to the quote I mentioned at the beginning, where one of the things, not just a modern mythology, but you think about it also ancient mythology, where, we always have this idea that we want to think that bad deeds and people who do bad things will always get what's coming to them. And, people who do try to be good people will, they'll get their rewards as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The first pilot of Star Trek, called The Cage, there's actually a line in there that sounds a lot like what you quoted from that article, where the Telosians tell Captain Pike, they tell him, wrong thinking will be punished and right thinking will be as quickly rewarded. And they're trying to train him to be what they want, what they want him to be. As far as Star Wars goes, I think the Jedi Order would be a good example of a sociological function, because they have a code of behavior. And you were saying too earlier, like the Sith, they have their code as well.
Then they also have their various hierarchy, with, most people know, with, like, for example, the Jedi, you start as a youngling, and then you go to become a Padawan, and then a Jedi Knight, and then if you survive long enough, a Jedi Master, and then there's the High Council. So you've got that, certain hierarchy there. And one of the things that occasionally you'll see people, they put forth their fan theories about how the Jedi are really the bad guys, and because they take these Force sensitive children from their homes, and when they're really young. And there was one video, I think it's the Stupendous Wave. He does a lot of Star Wars videos where he talks about stuff in the movies and stuff in the comics. And he actually did a video addressing this topic, where first, it is voluntary. So if a parent doesn't want to give up their child to the Jedi Order, they don't have to. And not only that, a lot of the cultures in the galaxy considered it an honor to have a child that would go to become a Jedi. And in some ways, really, the becoming a Jedi does mirror the hero's journey, because your call is, well, you're basically just Force sensitive. So it's like the Force chooses you, and then you go on your own road of trials as you go through your training as a youngling, and then you become a Padawan. And if you're able to pass the trials, because in Jedi lore, there are divisions of the Jedi Order for people who weren't Jedi or who didn't pass the trials. There was like a medical division. So these were ones that were specialized in using their Force powers to heal. There was an exploratory division. And I think there was also a diplomatic or division as well. So if a Jedi did fail their trials, they weren't just cast out. They were still given a role and a way to find, to be useful and to contribute to the Republic.
It's probably something like some of the monasteries over in Eastern Asia, right? Like, I think of that show, Kung Fu. You ever see that?
Okay, yeah, the Shaolin monasteries.
Yeah, there you go. Yep. And I think they took in boys that were young and kept them until they were in their late teens, early 20s. And, so I think it's the same kind of an idea as the Jedi Order taking the children in.
Yeah, because the reason they took it is because one of the things that's forbidden in the Jedi Code, or in Jedi, it's not necessarily in the Jedi Code itself, but rather just the Jedi ethics, is attachment. And George Lucas has even addressed this, because there's people who think Jedi have to be celibate. And it's like, no, they don't have to be celibate. It's just relationships and attachment. That's the only thing that's forbidden to them. And we see this with Anakin, how his attachment to his mother, how he can't fully break those bonds in the end is one of the things that helps lead him towards the dark side. Because we see in not Revenge of the Sith, Attack of the Clones. Yeah, how he goes back to Tatooine and he finds out what happens to his mom, and he slaughters an entire tribe of Tusken Raiders.
Yeah.
And we could even see that actually in Revenge of the Sith, because he's having these visions about Padme dying. And since he doesn't want to lose her, he doesn't know what to do. He talks to Yoda. He doesn't specifically tell her that, hey, I married a senator and got her pregnant. But he was just telling him how he had visions of a friend dying. And Yoda was trying to tell him that, it's not to be feared. You should celebrate their life. But he can't bring himself to that level of emotional attachment with Padme. And ultimately, that's something that Palpatine is able to use to, again, further Anakin's turn to the dark side.
One of the things I liked about, was it Christian Hayden? Was that his name?
Yes.
The guy, yeah. Was his ability to get that look on his face that he's checked out, and, like when he kills the Tusken Raiders. I was wondering if that might have been one of the reasons why Lucas hired him for the part, because he just had that like psycho look in his eyes. So yeah, I think he wasn't all together there emotionally, to begin with. He had issues that they probably should have realized before they put him through the training that they did. I was going to say, for Star Trek and the sociological function, one of the prime examples is the Prime Directive. That is it's their first order not to interfere with other worlds, which is a metaphor, I think, for how we should behave here on Earth. Don't mess around with other cultures. Leave them alone, which is the main message there. The thing about Star Trek is that it came out right in tandem with us really taking our first steps into space. It really is like a new age for mankind. And we have a mythology that's right there on the cutting edge, along with mankind going into space and trying to set down a set of rules, and examples of how to behave when we get out there,
And along a similar lines, we have actually taken that a step further, where there is an international treaty not to weaponize space, and that they've decided no one's going to own the moon. And of course, that also brings up the question, because there's talk of sending people to Mars someday. Okay, does that mean if the first country that can get someone to Mars, do they really have the legal right to claim ownership of it?
They can probably stake out a claim on Mars. It's a pretty big place.
Yeah.
So they, I suppose we could land on one side of it, and the Russians can land on the other side, and it would, never the twain shall meet.
Yeah. And I think there have even been treaties about weaponizing space, how there's a treaty to not put space-based weapons in orbit. Though with like science fiction, though, one of the things they usually explore is the ethics of this changing technology. Whether you could actually go back to like Isaac Asimov with his 3 laws of robotics,
mm-hmm.
which is something to really think about now that we are starting to see the field of robotics start to really advance. Can we program some equivalent into these robots? Of course, we're also talking about AI and how there's, AI created art, and someone even wrote a AI generated story. So it's almost like, are we making the means to our own destruction?
We could be. But on the other hand, it seems like we should have some control over how this stuff behaves. We don't want it to, destroy the world, and don't give it feelings, or, don't program it with anger, or,
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose there's an argument that these things could be like an emergent property too, once an AI reaches a certain level of sophistication or development, that it would somehow maybe take on these aspects that we didn't necessarily give to it to begin with. But though for something to be destructive or, to act human, it has to be sort of embodied like a human, I would think. And a lot of the stuff that drives us and makes us do bad things are like hormonal, and there's all these chemical interactions going on inside our bodies that have a lot to do with how we behave or misbehave. And robots, until we make some kind of a synthetic organic creature, wouldn't have that aspect to them. So I don't know if they would behave badly like we do if we didn't program them to do that.
To draw upon another sci-fi series, The Matrix, because you think about it, once a robot becomes intelligent enough where it can make its own decisions, well, then that brings up the point, are they going to be considered citizens or not? And what kind of social rights are they given?
Right.
A good example would be, have you ever seen the Animatrix?
Yeah.
Oh, what was it called? The Second Renaissance, I think. It's the one where they explain more, they go into more of the story about how the world of the Matrix came to be.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the turning points is there was a robot that killed a person because he was threatening to be deactivated, and the robot, he said he didn't want to die, so he was acting in self-defense. So again, that brings up a whole new thing. It's like, okay, well, what if we do get AI to that point? Are they subject to the same punishments that people are and the same rights that we are?
That's a really good point. And one that science fiction strives to answer, I think, and that is, what does it mean to be human? And the question originally was, if you look like me, then you're human. And that's how we were able to dehumanize like other races of man, was to say, well, they don't look like us, so they're subhuman or something. And we've been able to, I think, encompass all of humanity in this like brotherhood of man. But in science fiction, the further afield you go, you start to find creatures that look less and less human until you've got things that are completely non-human. And how do you treat them? And I think the answer is, if they think like us or the equivalent to us, then they're human. So if these robots become sophisticated enough that they want to be emancipated and they have every attribute that we do and every indication that they are like us, then we should treat them like us. And that's what science fiction, I think, teaches us to do.
And I think with Star Wars, there is a certain parallel when we talk about what it means to be human. You look at the clones. I mean, I'm not sure in the Star Wars canon how they were always treated, but when it came near after the Clone Wars ended, there was a clip I saw from the Bad Batch when Palpatine was talking about sunsetting the clone army, how they will follow unethical orders without any question. So are they really any better than robots? But you do see that clones do start to become more than just war machines. Mm-hmm. I know there was a couple in like the Star Wars Rebels series that were like that, where they did actually resist their programming during Order 66, and because they found out they had the inhibitor chips and they had those removed, so they truly had free will.
And so some of the Jedi survived because of that?
Yes. In Star Wars Rebels, Ahsoka Tano, she survives because one of the main clones, Captain Rex, ends up helping her, and he was about to shoot her, but you could see he was resisting because he didn't want to do it.
Interesting. Yeah, and they went beyond the limits of their programming, I guess you could say.
So this brings us to the last part, the pedagogicals. So this is, again, the how to live your life and the teaching function. There was a YouTube video I watched before when I was getting ready to record this, where the person was mentioning that one of the things that would fall under this particular function are the stages of life, such as birth, coming of age, maturity. When you finally reach adulthood, marriage, you go on to have your own children, old age, and then death, because these are universal themes.
Yep.
Doesn't matter where you live on the planet, your culture does have these cycles, and they're celebrated or they're commemorated in different ways.
We're probably one of the few cultures in human history that has done away with some of, probably not all of these, but definitely some of them. So we have a hard time figuring out when we're actually truly men and women, And this function is the foundation of the other three. Everything is built on top of the pedagogical, for that same reason that you were saying, that this goes through the stages of life. This is the universal function. Like this one in the first one, the mystical, metaphysical one, stay pretty consistent. The two in the middle, the cosmological and sociological functions, those can vary wildly from culture to culture and from time to time. But the pedagogical is the foundation of everything. And it's also about going from dependency to independence. And in Star Trek, Captain Kirk is a prime example of a true man who's independent. He's the captain of a ship away from what they would call the father social, which in his case would be Starfleet Command or the Federation Council. He was out on his own, autonomous, and able to make decisions for himself and for those under him. I think in Star Wars, I think Luke Skywalker might make a good example of the pedagogical function, how he develops from a farm boy who's dependent on his aunt and uncle to becoming an independent Jedi master to whatever he was in The Last Jedi. I'm not sure how you'd fit that in there, or if you even should try.
It is interesting the way they decided to move him, because of course there's the legends, the stuff that's non-canon now, and then the Disney canon, where in the legends material, he did eventually go on to get married, and I believe he did have kids. Where in the canon, well, he pretty much became that, that old, he was almost like he became a new version of Obi-Wan, where he was becoming this teacher to these next generation of Jedi, which unfortunately, Kylo Ren ended up putting an end to that. Even after becoming one with the Force, he still acts as somewhat of a guide to the other characters.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Like you mentioned Obi-Wan, he might be an example of somebody in the later stages of life preparing for death, because that's the idea. I think it was either Campbell or Jung talked about the two stages of life and how the first half of life is geared towards becoming and living and, becoming what you will become. And then the second half of life is geared towards fading off into death and to, accepting that eventual outcome and going through those stages of preparation for that. And that could be like the next great hero's journey, is what's on the other side of death's door.
That is true. And I know there's the Obi-Wan series, which again, I've only seen clips on YouTube. We haven't subscribed to Disney Plus yet, so I haven't had a chance to really, watch any full episodes. But I think that would be Obi-Wan's journey into, as you said, preparing himself for death, because he's witnessed a lot. In Phantom Menace, he saw his master Qui-Gon get killed by Darth Maul, and then, of course, the Clone Wars. Eventually, he has to fight and severely injure, his student who was like a brother to him. And then Order 66, and he finds out about how, Anakin killed children and how all these friends and people he knew were now dead because Palpatine wanted to get rid of the Jedi so they wouldn't interfere with his plans.
Yeah. Yeah, he'd really been through a lot, and then finally facing his old student again for the last time. Found out something interesting about that. Apparently right up till like the last draft of Star Wars, when they were writing it, Obi-Wan survives his encounter with Darth Vader, but they didn't have him doing much in the end. And it was actually Lucas's wife who suggested that they just kill him off. It'd be a much more powerful event. And because of that, they decided to go ahead and have him die at the hands of Darth Vader.
With Star Wars, when we talk about like with the Jedi Code and the teachings, and this might actually go maybe even back more into the mystical and the sociological, but in Star Wars lore, there's the Jedi Code and the Sith Code. With the Jedi Code being, there is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. And then we compare that to the Sith Code. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall set me free. So where the Jedi view the Force as a means to achieve peace, with the Sith, it's more all about power and control.
Right. That's interesting. I like that. And also, too, I was going to mention earlier, the saying, may the Force be with you. Apparently that came from Lucas wanting to say something like, may the Lord be with you, but didn't want to use that. So he took that saying and took out the Lord and put the Force in there. And so I didn't think about it again until you mentioned that last line of the Sith Code, where it was to say,
the Force shall set me free.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a take on another biblical verse. The truth shall set you free.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the Star Trek series, did they ever touch much upon the afterlife?
Not directly. They do have like Spock coming back to life. So he has sort of an afterlife, I guess, but they don't have like a heaven or a hell that you can go to in that sense of an afterlife. And I know they were toying with, after they killed Spock off and they were going to bring him back, if they should bring him back kind of like a ghost like Obi-Wan, but they decided to bring him back bodily, which I think was probably a better idea. And so they don't really touch on an afterlife, but they do get the idea that we can become non-corporeal in a sense. So, but you stay in the physical world. I think that goes along with the science aspect of their cosmology, because like in our modern world view, this idea of like Christ ascending into heaven, these ascensions of people and all that, we can't quite take them as being them going up into heaven, that because we kind of know what lies above the clouds in the sky. We have to sort of take it, I think, in a different direction. And they think that's what Star Trek does. And also, too, talking about mythologies, the idea used to be that the gods were up in heaven. Even the Greek gods were up on Mount Olympus, which is like a form of like a heavenly realm. And now in Star Trek, which is very humanistic, now it's men themselves are walking amongst the stars, like sort of like we are the gods up in the heavens and having godlike powers. I think that's, I guess, maybe in lieu of an afterlife, we've got things like that in Star Trek.
The reason I brought that up is because there was another YouTube video I watched a while ago, which was talking about how Sith and Jedi viewed the afterlife, where apparently it's the same place, but what happens there, the Jedi perceive it as heaven, whereas the Sith would actually more perceive it as hell. And that's this idea that you become one with everything, which with the Jedi, since they're used to thinking collectively and they're guided by compassion and a sense of concern for others, being able to connect with everything would be a peaceful state to them. But with the Sith, and this is one of the reasons why they're always trying to find ways to extend their mortal life, with the Sith, though, because they tend to be more individualistic and tend to look out more for themselves, this idea of losing your individuality to them would be considered hell, even though they would be in the same place as a Jedi. And unfortunately, I don't remember if the person said that was canon or if it was considered part of Legends, but I just thought that was an interesting perspective because I think it helps explain why you have Palpatine who tries to bring himself back, which he does in Rise of Skywalker, and in the Legends series, he actually does have this way where he has clones already made for him that represent what he looked like in his younger life, and he does have a way to actually transfer his consciousness into these clones.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I like the idea of the Sith and the Jedi basically going to the same place, but perceiving it and experiencing it differently.
That is an interesting idea, how the afterlife is, if it is what you make of it, where if you think that, if you go to what would be considered heaven, if you think it's going to be people sitting on clouds playing harps, and that's what it'll get. But if your idea of heaven is maybe just a campsite with a campfire and a tent in the woods, well, that's what you're going to get.
Yeah. Whatever it is, I would hate to think of how god-awful boring it would get after the first trillion years, or you're going to be there for eternity. It's
guess the way I see it is either something happens to us after we die or nothing happens. And honestly, I'm not sure which one is more terrifying.
Right. I used to find some solace in the idea that if there is nothing after we die, it'll be a nothingness so profound that we have never experienced anything like it in this life. So, so that itself was a little bit of solace. But as I've gotten older, and I don't think it's because I've gotten closer to death. I think I've gotten maybe a broader perspective on this idea. I used to be atheistic and not believing in anything after death, mostly because I couldn't think of an evolutionary function for it. Nature seems to be concerned with us from birth to reproduction, and then depending on the species, however long you need to be around to reproduce, to rear the next generation. And after that, you're on your own. And an afterlife just didn't fit into that at all. But talking about like emergent properties, and once you get to a certain complexity, things can happen that weren't, may not have been able to happen at a lower, level of sophistication. I think the whole question of an afterlife would have been, or even the question of life itself would have been something unimaginable prior to it happening, prior to us becoming, like matter becoming, animated somehow. And so the fact that we got to that point from inanimate material tells us that there could be another step afterwards. Have you heard of the Hegel triad by any chance? So
I have not, no.
So it has 3 steps, 3 stages, which is the thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis stage. And I used the Hegel triad to kind of come up with I try to come up with a scientific formula that I could fall back on to say, yeah, I think that this could be an explanation, or could give some insight into there being an afterlife where you have well, first I thought, before I went to the triad, I thought about how everything is dyadic in this world. Where I was even talking earlier about in the hero's journey, if something's going to happen, it's going to happen on a dyad, 2 things that are sort of opposite. And I thought, everything is dyadic or bipolar or dualistic, everything. And I thought, why should life be the only thing that isn't? Being that this would be the one half of life, and then the other half would be after death. That there should be a second half to life, or a second stage or something. Then I realized, well, there were two stages. You were in a state of non-existence and then in a state of existence. So there are your two sides. You didn't exist, and then you did. But then it still doesn't answer the third stage, which is going back into a state of non-existence. That's where the triad comes in, because with the triad states is that you have a thesis state. So let's say that was the state of non-existence, which would make being alive sort of an antithesis state. So this is sort of the unusual opposite of how things generally are. You're generally in a state of non-existence. You come into a state of existence, but then you can't go back to the same state of non-existence because of the fact that you've existed. This changes things. So you can't be in a state of non-existence. Well, the reason for that is because the third stage is a synthesis stage, which is the best part of both of the first two stages. The non-existence that you would experience after life can't be the same as the non-existence that you experienced before because you've been alive.
We started talking about science fiction and then got into philosophies and speculating about the meaning of the afterlife. So
we've been all over the place.
Yep, I think this is a good place to end this episode. So before we sign off, why don't you remind the audience where they can find your show and how they can contact you through social media?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I have a YouTube channel called MetaTrek, and you can find that at youtube.com/MetaTrek or at MetaTrek. And I'm also on Instagram. It's at MetaTrek Videos, and also on Patreon. If you'd like to become a supporter, that would be awesome. And it's also MetaTrek at Patreon.
Well, with that said, we hope you found this show interesting, and certainly went a bit longer than the average episode, but sometimes it's kind of fun to have these in-depth conversations. So thanks again for listening, everyone, and have a great day.
You live long and prosper.
And may the force be with you.
Yeah.
You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at poigamestudio.com. Follow us on Twitter at poigamestudio. Look us up on Facebook and email us at poigamestudio@gmail.com.